I inherit Alzheimer's disease? This is a great question, and before I get into it, I'd just like to say, if you don't want to sit through the next 5 minutes of me waffling because you don't like the way that I do my videos, or you just don't like me as a person, that's absolutely fine. Go and have a look at this website here instead. There's not much on there that I won't speak about in this video. So let's just leave it there. If you're still here, then I assume you want to hear me talk about it, so let's get into it. So the short answer is yes, you can inherit Alzheimer's disease, but this is very rare. And also, I'm talking specifically about Alzheimer's here. Different forms of dementia have different genetic risks associated with them. Alzheimer's disease is the most common form of dementia. That's what I've been asked about. That's what I'm going to speak about in this video. So let's do a quick recap. Apologies if you've already heard this from me before, but I think it's important we're all on the same page. So when we're talking about genetics, what are we actually talking about? So if we imagine all of our DNA is a huge cookery book, every letter in that cookery book is a part of our DNA. Then when we zoom out and we look at a specific section of that cookery book, a page, that is a recipe. And a specific section of our DNA in a recipe is a gene. Now that gene gives us the instructions to make a final dish. That final dish is a protein, and proteins all have different functions in the body, and they must fold into a certain shape, much like a lock has to fold into the right shape to be able to, a key has to fold into the right shape to be able to fit into a lock. In order to serve a specific function, a protein has to fold. When we have genetic mutations, this can mean that proteins do not form that correct shape and they lose their ability to function properly. But that's not the only way that mutations can affect proteins. It's also important to say there is a difference between genetic mutations and genetic variation. So a mutation we usually think of as having a negative impact, causing a disease or contributing towards a disease, whereas actually some variations, which is the same principle as a mutation, maybe one letter of our recipe has changed, can actually be protective. The final thing to say to sort of set the scene is in many different forms of dementia, these are diseases that involve proteins misfolding, forming clumps inside the brain. So in Alzheimer's disease, we know two of these go wrong. We see plaques, clumps of amyloid beta protein that form outside nerve cells, and we see tangles of tau protein that form inside nerve cells. And the amyloid beta plaques come first, and then this triggers tau misfolding and spreading throughout the brain. This is consistent with lots of different types of dementia. Parkinson's disease or dementia with Lewy bodies, for example, have clumps of alpha-synuclein protein called Lewy bodies. It's the same sort of principle. So when we talk about inheriting Alzheimer's disease, this is really rare, and inherited Alzheimer's disease is usually very early onset, in your 30s or 40s. And the way that this works is, I'm going to pop this figure on the screen now because it's a great demonstration. So if we look at the top left hand corner of this graph, these are genes, and the further left on the graph we are, the more rare mutation is. Further right, the more common it is. The higher up it is, the more serious it is, the more likely it is to cause disease. So those ones top left are really rare and also very, very high chance of causing disease. In some cases, it's 100%. And the interesting thing that we see in the three genes at the top left, that's APP, presenilin 1 and presenilin 2. All three of these genes are directly involved in amyloid beta. So APP is the amyloid precursor protein. This is the protein that makes, this is the gene that makes amyloid beta. Presenilin 1 and presenilin 2 are genes which make a protein which chops up amyloid. And so the reason that these genetic mutations cause the disease is because they are directly involved in that one specific protein that we know is the first thing that goes wrong in Alzheimer's disease. These genes are all associated with the direct function of that protein. And in different types of frontotemporal dementia, for example, the gene that I study, MAPT, that makes the tau protein, we know that mutations in the tau gene will also very, very high chance of giving you different types of frontotemporal dementia. So those genes that are involved directly in that protein have a very high chance of impacting your chances of getting a disease, but they are also very rare. And then when we move further down, we see genes like ApoE. So one other important piece of information is that we inherit 2 copies of our cookery books, one from each parent. And we can get different versions of our recipes. A different version of a recipe or a gene is called an allele. So with ApoE, this is apolipoprotein E. This is a gene that makes a protein that's involved in our ability to metabolize lipids, fatty things. In this case, it's really interesting because there are 3 versions of ApoE. We have ApoE2, we have ApoE3, and we have ApoE4. Now, ApoE4 increases our risk of getting Alzheimer's disease, but also different types of dementia. If we have 2 copies of ApoE4, that's one from each parent, that further increases our risk. If we have 2 copies of ApoE3, then that doesn't change our risk at all, but actually having ApoE2 reduces our risk of getting dementia. So in these cases, this is not inherited dementia. If you have 2 copies of ApoE4, that does increase your risk, but much in the same way that smoking increases your risk of cancer. It's not a guarantee at all. And I've made a video last week, maybe, on things that we can actually do to reduce our risk of getting dementia. And then the further down right in this graph that we go, we see much more common variants or mutations in genes which very slightly increase our risk of getting dementia. But these will absolutely not cause dementia, and this is one thing to be really careful about. So a lot of people, when they're asking about their genetics in terms of dementia, are asking because they have maybe family history of dementia. And genetic testing is only routinely offered for people with a really strong family history of early onset dementia, where usually there is a sort of genetic involvement. If you have 1 or 2 grandparents who have had, say, Alzheimer's disease, that's not usually, and certainly at a later age in their life, that's not usually a cause for concern. And so genetic testing will only really be offered to those people where there's a strong chance that they have one of the genetic mutations in the very top left of the graph. And DIY DNA testing kits I would not personally recommend for trying to determine whether you have inherited forms of dementia, because it's impossible to say, especially further down in the middle to the right-hand side, it's impossible to say whether you will or won't get dementia just from looking at those genes. So I hope that this has eased some anxiety. One thing to say, less than 1% of Alzheimer's disease cases are in that top left-hand corner of the graph. So these are rare cases of disease. If you have any questions, just let me know. Bye-bye.